once again. Probably not saying the same thing about me, but that's okay. So I'm not one of your good-looking leaders you should be looking for after this session of discussion. But it's good to be back. It's good to see so many of you are coming back. I still don't know what the syndrome is here for all you men who keep coming back to this. Something must be rubbing off on you, but I appreciate you and I don't envy you. But anyway, I'm in the same boat as you. When I come here to share, honestly, and I mean this with all sincerity, before I ever speak to any one of you, I'm speaking to myself. And this stuff, everything that I'm talking about, is directly applicable to my own life. And so that's why I know that it can be impactful, and I also know that it can be challenging. And I thank you, men, for engaging in this challenge and continuing on with us. So here it is, week 2, and we're going to get started. Last week, I began this series, which I'm titling Reconciliation, and you'll understand why I'm calling it that in just a little bit, by addressing 3 facets of broken relationships as they pertained to my own story. Now, if you remember, I shared how growing up, I felt distant from God, even at a very young age. And as a result, I, not knowing who I was as created in God's image, grew to become insecure. And eventually this led me to a place in my life where I didn't even like myself. I didn't even like myself within my own skin. And so I tried to hide. As a result of my disconnectedness from God and from myself, I found it nearly impossible to connect with other human beings in a real way. And this lonely state of isolation contributed to my eventual drug and alcohol addiction as I supplanted real relationships with chemical substances. But as it goes, the more I used to feel connected to the world and to other people, the more I actually became isolated, which in effect caused me to use more. So at least in my own life, there seems to be this pattern, this reoccurring pattern. When I am separated from God spiritually, I tend to be disconnected from myself psychologically, which stunts my ability to connect with other human beings relationally. The cycle of separation often compels me to attempt to fill in the blank spots in my heart with whatever temporary pleasure I can get my hands on. But these supposed pleasures and diversions, in the end, only cause me to become more isolated and more alone. That is the cycle of insanity I have been chasing my entire life. The reason why these type of things can never replace the real is because the synthetic and the temporal relationships of this world can never supplant what God intended for us. That is my story. And although we are at different places as we sit around in this room, I bet that each of us, if we are sincerely willing to look close enough, can trace out this cycle in some way, even within our own lives, no matter where you are. In some ways, as I will seek to demonstrate within the next couple of weeks here, we are all still wrestling in a state of spiritual disconnectedness from God. Hence, we struggle to recognize who we are as creatures created in His image, and therefore we struggle to make real connections with other human beings. The question that I always ask myself, and I started asking it last week, is why? Perhaps even more tangible, how did it come to be this way for us? Why are we so prone to distrust God and wander away to do our own thing to our own demise? Why do we often feel disconnected from ourselves and dislike the people who we have become? Why do we build walls around our lives in hopes of keeping others out and far away from our hearts. As I said last week, there is a distinctive reason why. And it all starts back at the beginning of our own story. As I explain this, may you behold the power of the Bible to speak truth into your own experience. For I find that no modern psychology or self-help therapies can probe the depths of the human crisis quite like the Bible does. The wonderful thing about it is that the Bible wastes no time in doing so. So the answer lies at the beginning of our story, as it is told through our first parents, Adam and Eve. Beginning in just the first chapter, or the third chapter of the first book of the Bible, we read about our story as it is told through the lenses of our first parents. Genesis chapter 3 tells us the story of what theologians have termed simply the fall. By this they mean the fall from God into human brokenness and sin and separation and death. In this story, we read about how God created mankind in his own image and gave him everything that he had made to enjoy and partake of. You can almost just imagine, because I think in pictures. I can just imagine as God is fashioning everything and walking with Adam in the cool of the day when it's just those two, and he's just showing them everything that he had created and how beautiful it is. Bringing the animals to Adam so that Adam could name them, and just telling them everything that I have made is yours. Take care of it. Enjoy it. Delight in it. Did you imagine that? The creation was incomplete. Because although Adam, our first father, had so much before him, he didn't have another human being to share his life with. So God created Eve as a life companion for Adam. And when Adam saw Eve, he fell deeply in love with her at first sight. I actually think that was the first time that whole concept of falling in love at first sight originated. Because as you read the story, and you know that when God brought Eve to Adam, he saw her. And again, imagine the picture of what is going on in this garden. He was the only human on the face of the earth, according to the scriptures. And then Eve arrives, as she was created from his side. And he sees her. And in Hebrew language, he says, "You are bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." In street terms, he's saying, we're tight. We're one. Nothing will ever break us apart. For this reason, a man shall leave his mother and his father, and he shall unite as one with his wife. You get the sense of this union between two human beings that perhaps has never been known since. Not tainted by any selfishness, by any self-ambition, but just pure love for one another. And they were connected at a level that us human beings can only wish for today. Now, Adam and Eve were given a task. Through their union of marriage and love, they were to fill the earth with more human beings. And humans were endowed with this ability to take the raw materials of the earth and to create something out of it. Just like their God who takes things from nothing and makes things out of it. And so, in the likeness of God, we're given this great task of creating things out of the earth. That's why we have engineers, scientists, teachers. We all have these great abilities given to us by God, and we all desire to work with our hands, to use our minds, to execute our plans. You ever think about that? I know that everybody in this room, perhaps even today, you have thought of something in your mind that did not really in the physical world, and you made it happen. You bear the image of God, and He's given you that ability. And so He gives us the raw materials of the earth, and He says, make something of it. So we see that God created us and gave us a purpose, and that purpose was to be lived out in the context of our relationship with Him, in the knowledge that we are created in His image, in union and fellowship with other human beings. And as you know, something went terribly wrong at this point in the story, which distorted and marred everything. Adam, our first father, was given charge to protect his wife and to keep watch over the garden. The Hebrew word translated as keep in the passage, to work and keep the garden, also carries this idea of protecting and guarding something. Now, by way of implication, if Adam was given charge to protect and keep the garden, then there must have been an enemy or something from which he needed to protect it from. And hence slips in the serpent, who initiates his attack on the hearts of mankind through a woman and through her husband, who stood right there next to her and did nothing about it. And just as an aside, men, how many times do we sit back and watch the members of our family being stolen away from us? As their eyes and their hearts are corrupted by the things that they're seeing, the things they're participating in, and because we don't want to create a ruckus or cause a problem, we just stand back and do nothing about it. We still have that charge to guard and watch and protect our families. So Eve eventually took the bait from the serpent, alluding to Satan, who corrupted her by suggesting to her that God was withholding something from her. And this is how it all begins. Remember, in the beginning, God created this lovely paradise for both of them to enjoy. And everything that was there, He said, all of it belongs to you. Except for that one thing. That one thing, I want you to stay away from it, because it will kill you. And as is our tendency, instead of seeing all the wonderful things that God has given to us in our lives, we're constantly looking back over our shoulders at that one thing that we're not supposed to have because it will kill us. That's where distrust begins to creep in, because somehow we believe that God is withholding good things from us. And I can just imagine Eve, as she's having this interaction with the serpent, beginning to believe his lies. Well, God doesn't want you to have that, because He knows that the day that you eat thereof, you will become like Him. Really? God's withholding that from me? Why wouldn't God want me to be happy? So she took the bait. In that moment, she began to distrust God, thinking that He didn't have her best interest in mind. And so she took matters into her own hands. So by not trusting in God, let me just add, I say Eve, but Adam was right there with her. By not trusting in God, we pulled back and we broke our relationship with God. This is where it all began to fall apart. There are three disastrous consequences which immediately preceded this event. You and I, and our parents and children, still bear the scars of this awful reality, even right now as we're sitting here. Last week we asked the question, why? Why do we often feel so distant from God? Why do we often feel so uncomfortable even within our own skin? And why are we often so cut off from one another and experiencing the kind of relationships that every single person in this room craves, regardless of what you say? Well, if you want the answer, I'm going to give it to you right now. The moment that Adam and Eve sinned against God, our spiritual relationship with Him was broken. God gave Adam a warning. He said, the day you eat thereof, you will die. And what I want you to understand, that in theological ways, death is not a ceasing to exist. Think of it as being a separation or a state of separation. And to illustrate this, when your soul and your spirit are separated from your body, you are physically dead. Right? Well, when your spirit is disconnected and separated from God, you are spiritually dead. When you are cut off from yourself, you are psychologically dead. And when you are cut off from other people, you're relationally dead. So God wasn't using hyperbole. He wasn't blowing things out of proportion when He said, the day you eat thereof, you will die. Yes, they began to die physically at that moment, but they died instantly in a spiritual way. And this becomes evident in the story, because before this time, remember, Adam was with the Lord in the cool of the day. He walked with Him. I imagine that Eve was there with them. You can almost imagine that when God showed up in this